rushed, and that's how we ended up in this mess.
Well, exactly. We are live. It's time for that lovely, your favorite time again. Two liberals and a Marxist. Me, Pyoty, Kurzin, geopolitics. Professor James Lendsay and Michael Rossi, poli-sci. Of course, naturally, we know who is the Marxist amongst us. Woohoo. And who is with two liberals, although one is more, I think, self-identifying than the other. Yes, no, this is the show where we try to react and respond to as many different geopolitical events as possible, hosted by myself, with my two compatriots here. Although one of them, before we came on air, is elegantly inebriated, quote. I'll let you figure out which one that is. I'm kidding, but we're going to have, I think, a good wide-ranging discussion, guys. I was just taking stock of it, actually, in preparation for our chat. There's so many issues. We've got, well, let's just go through them, right? We've got Ukraine, potentially, direct talks now in Saudi Arabia, Putin's suggestion after he rejects the ceasefire. We've got Iran nuclear talks, which are going quite well, apparently, and also the potential that Trump is going to drop a bombshell of recognizing Palestine on his visit to Saudi Arabia. And then, of course, we've got the Indian-Pakistani escalations, which are far worse, far different, and I think probably what we will focus on for the first part of our chat, and then maybe go to Ukraine. And of course, a new Pope, which, James, I know you wanted to touch upon as well. So quite a lot of things coming up, guys. Do drop your comments on our respective channels about what you want us to cover or your thoughts, and we will try and hit them up in the last quarter of the chat or something. But I don't know, guys. I mean, where do you want to start? I think India-Pakistan is a huge concern. It seems to have, well, the ceasefire seems to be holding now, but I don't know. I mean, it's crazy, right? James, I don't know. You covered it, right?
Yeah, I mean, look, I know when we were thinking about, what we should cover, because although, we tend to range far and wide, it's always a case that we like to have a sort of a broader theme, and really India-Pakistan was the obvious one. And I know that sort of some would say, well, there's a ceasefire. It's not such a big issue. Of course it is, because this is just a ceasefire, and this is an issue that has been going on 80 years. And I think my real concern in watching all of this, of course, is that, yes, all right, we hopefully avoided any too serious an incident, not downplaying this at all, because remembering the attack that started all of this, and then the accusations from India that Pakistan had been behind it. And that this is obviously a trend that we have seen over many, many decades, and these two nuclear powers. And really, I think what concerns me most of all in all of this is the fact that we're not talking about trying to resolve this issue. I work on international conflict. I don't like to take the position that there are no unsolvable conflicts, but I would say that this is about pretty much as close as you can get to being an unsolvable conflict in international relations. And the fact that it's playing out between two major nuclear powers, which are willing to trade shots across that ceasefire line from time to time, and are engaged in all sorts of nefarious activity. And I think there probably is fairly solid evidence to say that Pakistan has been supporting these militant groups. Equally, there does seem to be, certainly Pakistan makes claims that India is behind an insurgency in its southwest province of Balochistan. So they say that there's tit for tat going on here. But I think that this is the thing that really, really worries me in all of this, that, we can say India and Pakistan haven't gone to war, but, is it really,
I think
we've got this issue?
No, I mean, before I pass to you, Michael, I mean, a couple of things I'm very active on Twitter, as you guys know. And I think one of the things, we were covering this live in real time during Spaces, sort of what Clubhouse used to be. So we were listening to people on the ground. You could hear the bombs, the artillery fire off in the background often. And one of the things that really struck out to me at the time is that this is different. This escalation is 99. It's 1973 or 1963, 1971, if I'm getting my dates slightly mixed up. But those are the more severe, I think, clashes. And this was definitely one of the worst ones we've seen. It's not the missile, misinterpretation that happened a couple of years ago. It's not a flare-up. It's a proper clash. And my concern is the nuclear element, not from conventional strategic ICBMs, and I know you're not military, James, but like I touch upon that as well. And for me, it's more the tactical usage, right? A low yield tactical nuke, like we've sort of thought Putin might use in Ukraine a couple of times, because also Pakistan's nuclear doctrine is basically they will respond with nuclear arms if they feel under threat through either nuclear or kinetic conventional military action by India. So that is one of my biggest concerns. But the other thing, and Mike, I'm curious from your perspective, given you are sort of nearer this whole area, is the information warfare. Both sides have been as much about determining the narrative. And, I've been lambasted by Pakistanis and Indians because I refuse to try and take a side on this too much. I mean, I think it should be noted that this happened because of April 22nd, which is in Pakistani territory, unfortunately, i.e. the terrorist groups. And so, India wasn't, some people think this is a false flag by India. I feel that that's extremely far-fetched, but, a lot of Indians are absolutely outraged. Those who are very supportive of Modi, my audience has been angry with me for trying to be balanced or acknowledging of all the grievances and such. So I don't know, Michael, I've dumped a lot of thoughts there. What's your take, given you're in, the region and seeing this all closer?
So, I mean, I have a number of Indian colleagues that are working with me here in Tashkent. They're going home in a couple of weeks. Almost all of them have, reached their own independent conclusion that this is not going to escalate beyond what, is already. Both countries are nuclear powers. Neither of them are going to get to the point where they, use nuclear weapons. The basic understanding that I have from my end, and I'm, only getting this from, my colleagues and, coworkers, is that this is really a way for Modi to consolidate his power and, I guess in many cases, reconfigure the hegemony of BJP against growing entrenchment, growing opposition from the Indian National Congress and other parties. I don't see this as escalating into a nuclear war. I don't see troops on the ground. I don't see some people calling for the dismemberment of Pakistan, which most, Indian intellectuals would say would be an absolute disaster or be a full-on security dilemma. I am surprised that it reached the level.
Sorry to interject, just to say, I have, just for all of you who are wondering, I just had my doorbell ring, and that's because I'm waiting on a package, and that package is lighting equipment because we're upscaling the studio. So I'll be back in 1 second, everybody. Michael, please continue, but I have to take this, otherwise,
Okay, I guess, James, it's you and me just having this conversation.
Yeah.
All right, fair enough. Fair enough.
No, we know that Pyoty briefed us that this was a possibility and upgrading the quality of his presentation, all good stuff. But no, Mike, I mean, I think you make the point. But I think this is the problem that I have in all of this, and this is something, I remember one of the first jobs I had out of university was working on a project on Greek-Turkish relations, and I was involved in a group that was looking at very active measures to prevent standoffs, incidents from escalating into full-scale conflict. And I think the thing that's always taken me since then is this very acute awareness of how even relatively small incidents can rapidly spin out of control, and how very easy it is for major crises to erupt. And when you are talking about two nuclear powers, this is something that I think, has always got to be in the back of the mind. I think you made sort of the point there that was really important in all of this is, of course, there is a fundamental imbalance between India and Pakistan militarily. which makes this especially dangerous. Because there is that sort of sense that if Pakistan feels that India is pushing too hard, then it may feel that it's got, and has been mentioned that, whereas India has an avowed no first strike policy, Pakistan doesn't. Precisely that reason of sort of saying, look, we understand that, we are a smaller armed force. If we have to do this, we will do it.
Exactly.
So I think that this is the real concern that I have in all of this, because I agree. I mean, from a very rational perspective, I think you'd have decision makers in both countries saying very clearly, we have no intention whatsoever of allowing this to escalate to a greater confrontation. But the problem is these things can happen. They can happen on relatively small incidents. That's the scary thing.
I'm back, everybody. Sorry about that. I do have a box of stuff now. I'm not trying to make light of that, but yeah, it's quite fun. If you run a YouTube channel, you have all this equipment. But to your points, guys, I was listening intently. I think one of the things, James, that was quite revealing about the events afterwards was that the jet involved in the downing of the Rafael, which has been confirmed, and I know Indians don't like that, but it is being confirmed by multiple independent sources, Western or not. It was done by a Chinese aircraft, obviously Pakistani flew and piloted, but what I think is being noted by the defense industry, at least, is that the Chinese clearly have a 5th generation set of fighters and equipment that is emerging, which can deal quite decently to Western aircraft. So there's a separate dialogue that is beginning to develop about not even India, Pakistan, but about China and its capabilities vis-a-vis French, British, American aircraft, which I find quite interesting. And it was an illustration of China's ability to not just have its own effective military, because we don't really know the size of the Chinese budget in terms of expenditure versus America's, for example. But not only that, but they are a consistent arms supplier now. The Russians supply a huge amount to India, but China has been upscaling its support for Pakistan and Bangladesh through their string of pearls strategy in the past, well, you can say 10, 15 years, really coinciding with the BRI. So I think it was quite a good illustration of how foreign equipment is being leveraged by other countries, in this case, Pakistan or India, in this exchange. But I agree with you, Michael. Also, I don't think we're going to see a further escalation. I think the flare-ups that we saw yesterday after the ceasefire was established were more miscommunication between the political and military arms. From what I understood from contacts in the region, they said that the Pakistani government were firmly about, we are respecting the ceasefire, but there had been a misunderstanding from the military, or they want to continue. So I think that shows the concern on the Pakistani side, which is you may have your reservations about Modi or his approach to governance, but he is India functions as a state, whilst Pakistan has been on this precipice of failing state, military junta kind of style regime.
And that's the point. And that is the point to make here, because, India has the numbers, India has the leverage. Does India want to turn Pakistan into a failed state? Because, the nationalists within India are more than happy to break Pakistan up into a series of 3, 4, different statelets. This is going to create an absolute security dilemma within the region, which will necessitate Afghanistan, India, Iran, among others, to take action. I just don't see this. I cannot see that. If I'm wrong, let's have another podcast where I will spend, another half hour where I say, mea culpa. But, I cannot in any good faith right now see India willing to break up the state of Pakistan into a series of 3 or 4 statelets, which will just create greater security dilemmas within the region.
Yeah, I have to jump in just on reading the comments. And there's a couple of rather snarky ones, sort of 3 white guys talking about India and Pakistan. Well, guys, if you insist on arming yourselves with nuclear weapons, you then become a bit of a problem for the wider world.
Yes.
So don't be surprised when you get people from outside of South Asia talking about this issue.
Pakistani vocalists who criticize and belittle Western issues, then
yeah, precisely. Happy to jump in and pass comment on what's going on in other. No, absolutely no. I'm just referring to a couple of these comments that it's quite sad that people feel that.
Yeah, you don't own an issue just because you come from that area, right?
And invariably, you can't actually take a step back and look at that issue, and especially when you make comments like that.
No, I don't think so. And it doesn't mean we are prescribing solutions. We're simply discussing the situation.
And this is a very serious. I mean, there are very good reasons why the world was watching this showdown, because if it does blow up, I mean, we are talking two very, very large countries, and with nuclear weapons. So yes, of course, it becomes an issue.
But I think, James, you mentioned it at the beginning, and I kind of do want to get into this a little bit more, which is obviously there is the separatist movements that exist within the region, Balochistan, Khalistan. There are these areas that sort of some people think India is fueling greater, separatist movements in Pakistan. India feels the same about Pakistan's movements for Khalistani movements, etc. So, I kind of put it to you guys, how much do you think that this is intertwined with all of that? This is a self-determination issue for Kashmiris themselves. Who do they want to be part of? Do they want to be a sovereign nation? I mean, I don't think that's likely at the moment, but you know what I mean? How do we square this circle? James, you're the
well, one thing I'd say, which was sort of quite interesting, and I think you alluded to it as well, Pyoty, is that like others, I mean, I made a video about what had happened in Kashmir and the horrific attack there. What was very interesting was the very negative response that came from a lot of Indians, and especially Indian nationalists. And there were two things that really stood out, which is driving a very particular narrative. The first is that I didn't want to call the group that carried it out terrorists. And I don't know how many times I had to say it. Look, there's a very good reason now that news organizations, academics don't like to use the word terrorist, because it has become so heavily laden. And the point that I was trying to make is that, if an Indian carried out an attack in the United States, whether that is a Hindu, whether it's Sikh, whether it's Muslim, it would be referred to as terrorism. Whereas if a white supremacist went out and shot an Indian, it would be referred to as a hate crime. This is the thing. People are getting very, very concerned with this, and we see this in the way that the reporting of the Middle East goes. It's always a Palestinian terrorist. It's never a Jewish settler terrorist. So what's happened is that news organization, and I think with good reason, are saying we're not going to use this term. We're going to refer to them as bombers, gunmen, invariably men, attackers, militants, insurgents, ones that actually can be used with a much more neutral tone of language. And I think that this is really important because, as I say, the amount of comments I had about that, and it was taken as an outrage, a grave insult that I hadn't called them terrorists. And I said that, look, there is a very good reason why, and it's nothing to do with how one might feel about this particular attack. It was a horrific attack. But there is, as I say, there's very good reason that we're using certain language now in international relations to describe incidents, because terrorism has become so heavily weighted as a term, and it becomes actually part of the narrative. I think the other thing that really stood out to me in a lot of this was the way that there was a refusal by many in India to accept the agency of Kashmiris, that this was just Pakistan did this. This was Pakistanis. It was nothing to do with people from Kashmir. Pakistan had obviously sent people across the border. Now, look, that might be the case, and I'm not going to deny it. I think there is very good evidence to suggest, and at this point, Indians would now be furious because I'm not saying very clearly that Pakistan was behind it, but there is good evidence to suggest that, yes, Pakistan has been supporting a lot of these groups. But I think the trouble is you get into conflicts and you see how often that this is used to say that a group that actually has its own legitimate concerns, its own grievances, are unimportant. They're just pawns of another power. And so it becomes about India versus Pakistan, which then becomes a way of avoiding any discussion that there is quite clearly a Kashmir issue. And again, look, this is not just something you see in India, Pakistan. You see this in other conflicts around the world. It's a very, very common situation. You drive the narrative that it's the forces behind it, and that means that you don't actually have the issue on the ground. And I think, as I say, so these are two things that really actually, in listening to the responses to this attack, really stood out for me.
Yeah, I think I would say a couple points to that. I mean, number one, this agency is still very much a case for, I don't know, unrecognized territories that are disputed. During the spaces that I was hosting, I was referencing a lot Israel and Palestine because it is a example of disputed territory, and you have independent non-state actors which are seeking certain goals which differ to, say, the recognized governing body, in that case Palestinian Authority, and the state actor in this case Israel, right? Kashmir is slightly more complicated because you have the Chinese claim to it, and you also have the UN sort of idea of how the borders should be broken up, or the UN recognized borders, which obviously India and Pakistan both object, because India claims the whole thing, Pakistan claims a bit more than that, and then China, it's all overlapping. But my concern about all of this also is that on one hand you have a state which has a very popular leader. India absolutely adores Modi. Maybe he didn't do quite as well in the election last year, but it was still a landslide. And it's unquestionable that Indians across the political spectrum are 100% behind what New Delhi has been doing. And keep in mind, Modi gave basically free rein to the military to respond however they saw fit, which was quite an interesting designation of responsibility. But on the Pakistani side, we have a country that is effectively run by a military junta. It's not the Tatmadaw in Myanmar, but it is near enough that. They have imprisoned the most popular guy who could have probably prevented this. I'm not saying I know everything or support everything about Imran Khan, but he is clearly what the Pakistani people want. And so you have a bit more of a lawless state, which does harbor, unfortunately, terrorist group cells. And therefore, whilst I have my reservations about the Indian side, the Pakistani side is certainly the more volatile of the two. And whilst they are very capable, you go toe-to-toe on a conventional kinetic basis, India does have the more, well, they rank higher in the global firepower index and such. So it's not really an equal footing, but when it comes to nuclear weapons, it doesn't matter. So yeah, I mean, ultimately it would be nice to see sort of self-determination given to the Kashmiris, but that's not going to happen because neither main state is willing to acknowledge a compromise, right? I don't know, Michael, I've probably said a lot there and you disagree with half of it as the Marxist, right?
No, not, I mean, the thing with Indian politics today is, Modi is, you had mentioned that, Modi is incredibly popular, but he's popular because he operates as a national populist. And we've had many conversations on, in this three-way discussion about the versatility of national populism, which gets right to the heart of, visceral, nationalist, cultural, non-elitist, anti-intellectual sentiment within many states today. India is, for the most part, a country, similar in structure to that of the United States, the UK, and other Westminster parliamentary democracies, in that it's a two-party country. In India today, you have the BJP, of which Modi is a part of, and you have the, the Indian National Congress, the INC. Both parties are basically trying to lobby their ideology against each other as saying that one is more corrupt than the other. And Modi has been in power for many, many years. The Indian National Congress is becoming increasingly fragmented and leaderless. But one of the elements of the BJP has always been playing to this idea of India as a Hindu nationalist state. The primary identity within India are Hindus. The primary religion, the primary culture is Hinduism. Despite the fact that about 20% of the population are non-Hindu, Pakistan has always been the perennial other. And so it's not a popular sentiment to recognize, but Modi plays very well into the idea of Pakistan being the primary antagonist to India, and the disputed territory of Kashmir is effectively his ace in the hole, right? We've talked about disputed territories regardless, whether it's Karabakh in Azerbaijan, Kosovo in Serbia, Abkhazia, South Ossetia, Crimea, whatever you want. Kashmir has been this, one big issue. India claims certain amounts of territory. Pakistan claims the other. There's a separatist movement within either. And playing this, war card between India and Pakistan is one way for Modi to effectively, rally around the flag, wag the dog, right, in this case. And he knows that he has the manpower, he has the leverage, he has the capability of going militarily toe-to-toe with Pakistan. Does he want to, ultimately invade Pakistan? Does he want to just simply deter it? Does he want to break the country up? This is the big question that many people within India, at least, within Central Asia, the people that I'm working with are asking, are we talking about just simply neutralizing Pakistan, or at the same time supporting separatist movements within areas of Pakistan, like Baluchistan, to weaken the country, within? I'm going to admit right here and now, right, I'm not the primary expert on India, right? James knows probably far more than I do, on this, and I will defer that to him. But what I also know is that many people within India, at least as far as the people that I've talked with, they might be, patriotic in terms of taking the war against Pakistan in the name of Kashmir, in the name of aggression against the Indian state. Do they want to actually take the war to a point where they weaken the internal sovereignty of Pakistan, which is far more volatile than anything India could ever possibly hope to be, and create a regional security dilemma, is something that, at least at this point, I do not believe they want to do.
I think that's a fair point. I have my reservations personally about Modi. A lot of my audience are very strong supporters of Modi and are critical of a couple of videos I produced recently, which were a little bit more, acknowledging of my reservations there versus the guests which I've had, which are, staunchly supportive of Modi. But I think that, setting aside the reservations you might have about the political system or party, the governing administration, it is not in any way comparable to a state that is just barely functioning. And that isn't meant to sound nasty against Pakistan. I've got several Pakistani friends, but unfortunately it is the case that one is much off than the other. And, I don't believe for a second, to be honest, this was a false flag from India. Why would they suddenly decide on April 22nd, yes, let's kill 26 of our own Hindu citizens and Kashmiris as well? Doesn't make any sense to me. And my biggest question, James, maybe I'll put this to you for your thoughts, is sort of to what extent was Pakistan involved in the events back then? I don't have enough confidence to say that I think they were or they weren't, but, they did happen to house the biggest terrorists of, recent memory, right? So it is a concern. But James, I don't know. What do you think?
No, I mean, there's absolutely no doubt about it. And I mean, look, I think that the thing is that when I think about these situations, I mean, I'm not coming into this and trying to say some sort of expert on India, Pakistan, and their internal politics. As I say, I'm looking at it from outside, and the concern that a lot of people have about this situation, or if they don't have concern, why they should be concerned about it, as an international security issue, and trying to make sense of this. And as I say, I think the point I would really come back to is, yes, look, so Pyoty, you made a really good point. I mean, that we have known for a very long time, that Pakistan has been involved in supporting various groups. That, as I say, I think the weight of evidence is quite clearly the case. I think what we have here, so without going into the nitty gritty of on the ground, but as I say, I mean, let's think of it in terms of some of the sort of ideas, and we're talking a very classic proxy conflict that's going on. And as I say, the argument that Pakistan would say is, well, that this cuts both ways. India has also been supporting groups that have been waging against Pakistan. I wouldn't put that beyond the realm of possibility that, as I say, this has been a very, very long-standing conflict, that both countries have been up against each other. But I come back to this initial point that this is an issue and it's not going away and it's flaring up. And all right, this time it might have been able to be contained, but will it be the same next time? And yet there seems absolutely no way of resolving the fundamental issue at stake. It seems, and I stand to be corrected, that if you could resolve Kashmir, and I'm saying I don't think that's actually possible, and I'll talk in a sec about why, but if you could resolve that, then you have got rid of the biggest bone of contention between these two countries. The trouble is you're now left with a very long legacy of hatred, which is going to take a very long time to overcome. Right. But we can say, look, that's something that can be dealt with down the road. But unless and until you can solve Kashmir, you're going to have this constant bone of contention between these two countries. And yet it seems absolutely impossible to resolve this.
I just want to, if you can blend this into your response, but we've seen a general rejection, I think, increasingly of self-determination for greater centralization of control, if that makes sense, right? Since Trump has come into office, he's really been talking about, basically kind of revanchist rhetoric, right? Retaking territory through force for self or national interests, national security interests, which is quite a shift away from what we might have seen in the peak of neoliberalist or whatever of the 2000s of greater self-determination, autonomy. I personally more veer towards that. I would prefer countries to have greater dissolution of representation in Ethiopia. I think has a pretty unique system, which would be great to see that. But I think we're going in the opposite direction, right? Mm-hmm. And I just don't think that Kashmir is going to be sort of given either the opportunity to be a full-fledged state or given at least autonomy to the extent that it can represent itself in, health policy, education policy, whilst, the nation takes care of the foreign and defense or something like that. I don't know if you disagree with that, but.
I mean, there have been ideas that have been put forward for it. I mean, so for anyone who might not know, I mean, essentially, so when Britain left the Indian subcontinent in the late 1940s, I mean, you had part of India which came under direct British rule, but then you had all these princely states. I think there were about 500 or so of them, and they were effectively given the choice of either join India or Pakistan or become independent. But very few took independence, and there was a lot of pressure that was put on the ones that expressed an interest in independence not to pursue that they should either fall into line and join either India or Pakistan. Interesting, funny enough, and I've already mentioned Balochistan. Balochistan was one of the others, along with Kashmir, that initially wanted to pursue independence. But in the case of Kashmir, what you had is a rather unusual situation in that you had a majority Muslim population, but the Maharaja, the prince in charge, was Hindu. And very soon, I mean, we're talking within days of Indian and Pakistani independence, there started to be, it was put down to tribal Pakistani groups, but, there's always been that lingering sense that Pakistan was absolutely behind it. And again, this is the point that Indian nationalists will be furious because, of course, Pakistan was behind it. But look, whether it was or not, but we know that there was these incursions by Pakistani tribal groups. And at that point, the Maharaja feeling threatened, said to India, right, fine, okay, and signed the treaty union with accession to the state of India. And so that ultimately becomes the sort of, the source of this conflict. So you had a Hindu ruler, but a Muslim majority population. And there is the sense that had they been given self-determination, then the people would have chosen to join with Pakistan. And obviously, this was one of the first incidents that the UN got involved with. And it's been really interesting, actually, the story of the UN on this, because the UN was very heavily involved right at the start, but it's now barely involved at all. I think the last major Security Council discussion on India, Pakistan, on Kashmir was 1965. So, we're talking 60 years, which is incredible if you think about it. It's such a major issue, partly because, and to be very honest, India does not want to have international involvement. It sees this as a bilateral issue. It would prefer to deal with this directly with Pakistan, and so has rejected. So what we see is we have, again, it come back, and I realize I'm hogging things a bit, that we can be talking about these ceasefires. So you can have international involvement in trying to broker a ceasefire, but that can't then continue into having international involvement to try and broker some sort of resolution to this issue. So we just, again, we come back to the fundamental point that this is an issue that shows no sign of being resolved. And as long as it remains a bone of contention between the two countries, then it obviously becomes a source of concern that we're going to see these periodic flare-ups.
Yeah, for sure. Just one quick question on my end. Am I lagging? Or, okay, for some reason I did a thumbs up. Is my connection okay? Some people.
No, you're fine as far as I'm concerned.
Okay, good.
Yeah, it seems to be coming.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. No, I just wanted to say on the UN front, I mean, look, from the time that I was there in New York, Washington, India is seen as a very dark horse in a sense that it isn't part of the Security Council Permanent Five. Obviously, it should be, and there's a lot of emphasis on that. But the problem is that as soon as you get a potential, reformation of the council, then Pakistan demands equal representation as well, and then it goes round in a circus. And I just don't see that ever. Well, we could talk about UN reform being a pipe dream anyway, but I just don't think that at the moment. It's interesting, I think, from the Indian perspective. They are one of the biggest suppliers of peacekeepers to foreign conflicts in Africa. Yet when it comes to issues closer to home, they don't want international organization input, right? There is that inconsistency there. They like to be upholders of international law, but then when it comes to their matters, I mean, like any state, to be honest, the British are as hypocritical in that regard as well. The Chagos Islands comes to mind. But I don't see this matter being resolved because it's sort of something, it's not as pressing as Israel-Palestine because Israel is obviously directly related to the United States and therefore sort of that gets precedence in the eyes of Western media. But Kashmir is sort of something that is always lingering. I consider it to be one of the biggest concerns globally because of the nuclear element. This isn't US-China where the role of geographic proximity changes the calculus of both. They both, India and Pakistan, directly border one another. They both have capable strategic ICBM immediate launch capabilities. But the thing that I'm curious again about is their tactical nukes, their lower yield weapons, and whether or not, if push comes to shove, one of them would feel, well, this is enough of a legitimate reason to launch one.
Right.
Because then it goes off. And to be fair, actually, Iran has been tacitly, and Turkey, actually, that's something we should talk about, is the role of Turkey in all of this. Mm-hmm. They've been incredibly supportive of Pakistan. And you are, Michael, in a part of the world where the Turks are very influential as well through the OIS. They try to be OIS organization and such. So I don't know. What do you think about that?
Okay, so there's a couple of things to think about here. I want to take this into a broader concept beyond the India-Pakistan conflict of right now. And I want to talk about the issue of territory, sovereignty, and stateness, because this is something that has been an issue since the start of the special military operation in Ukraine, right? Russia is calling for a ceasefire in Ukraine, but has stipulated its demands for territorial readjustment, right? Which ultimately, involves redrawing the borders of a sovereign state. And all three of us have talked about this at length on this channel, about the risk, the very threat to the post 1945 international order of peace by redrawing the borders. So I want to emphasize, I am not an expert on the India-Pakistan conflict. But what I know, at least now, is that you have three large groups. You have one group, the Indian Sovereign Group, that basically just seeks to neutralize Pakistan in its claim over Kashmir. The other are the more vociferous, vocal nationalists that are calling for the opportunity to dismember Pakistan into at least 2 or 3 different statelets. And then you have the self-determination group within Kashmir that's seeking to capitalize on the security dilemma between the weakness of both India and Pakistan, all of which, call for the redrawing of borders, which is something that is absolutely, anathema to international world order today, at least as far as the liberalist West, NATO, the European Union, the United Nations, what have you, right? So my big thing here is whether or not the conflict between India and Pakistan has more to do with whatever local grievances have erupted over Kashmir, over border issues, and whether or not this is something that, nationalists in India are using as a way of weakening and ultimately dismembering the state of Pakistan, which I've said before. The other, issue is whether or not this is just electoral positioning by Modi and the BJP to say that India is under attack. The BJP will be the one to defend India's sovereign territory, or whether or not this is something that is going to create outside involvement. Because we have to remember, India is a member of BRICS. Pakistan is supported by China, a member of BRICS, and openly supported by Turkey, as you mentioned beforehand. Not a BRICS member, but an influential power within the region. This has the potential of bringing in external factors into supporting either India or Pakistan into this conflict. And whether or not this is something that is little more than just, electoral rhetoric for the next coming year or so, or whether this is really something that has been brewing for the last couple of decades between these two countries, in which one country seeks to assert its dominance, its, sovereign superiority at the expense of the other.
I think that the other element in underlying a lot of that is the religious factor. A lot of Indians who are staunchly supportive of Modi see this as more about just Islam is the problem. And by default, therefore, Pakistan, because it's an Islamic nation, it's just generally the whole religion, the whole country is it needs to be dealt with, quote unquote. I heard from one sort of more extreme voice over the past few days. So I definitely think that for many Indians, they cannot feel at home or at peace when there's such a sort of militant based country around, fueled by Islam. Islamists are the issue. And, to a certain extent, I can appreciate that. But at the same time, Modi has had a very influential role in changing attitudes towards the minority groups in India that are identifying as Islamic as well. So, yeah, it's complicated. And I don't really see this improving until you get, number one, a stable government, first and foremost in Pakistan. Less divisive vitriol in both sides about each other, And thirdly, and most importantly, I think, is obviously greater representation or voices for the Kashmiris themselves, and how they seek to be governed, or, well, talking about territorial designation, if that makes sense. But yeah, I mean, we could go on about this, or maybe we should switch gears into Ukraine and Russia, if you guys want to do that. Michael, you might be a bit more comfortable and expert. You can bring out your Rusko.
I'm going to say right here, right now, to everybody that is watching, right, I am much more qualified to talk about, Russia, Ukraine, than I am about India, Pakistan. So, I've seen what's going on, but I am not listen.
Yeah, but Michael, don't worry. I think what I would say is that you probably, to your credit, you've unsullied yourself with India, Pakistan on your channel. I think Pyotr and I are probably, because we have dealt with this and we've dealt with the fallout from it. And I have to say, if I might just sort of chime in and say that
just wanted to share the lovely comments we're getting, everybody, as well.
It's really quite incredible, the abuse that comes from it. By the way, to the person who said listening to a Brit talking about this, I was never actually part of the East India Company, nor was I part of the government that decided to partition India, Pakistan. If I might just make that very clear. So this constant, this idea that just because I'm British that I can't possibly talk about what else is going on. Yeah, I've spent 35 years studying conflict. That's what, I'm interested in. How does this play out against the bigger issues of conflict that we're looking at? So to everyone who's making those comments, can I just clarify that I had no role in partitioning India and Pakistan?
I was going to ask James, what part of Hindustan were you born in? You look very good for your age.
Yeah, I was going to say, actually,
I hadn't thought of it in those terms.
I thought
but yeah, look,
right? Because of your focus on Russia and Africa, right? So you've been down in the Sahel. It's a funny one, isn't it? How these sorts of things, and also So Michael, I'm just saying is I think Pyotr and I have to say, guys, that also and especially I'm going to direct this at the Indian nationalists, guys. You don't do yourself any favors by being quite as unpleasant. When people, I cover a lot of issues, Pyotr covers a lot of issues, and it becomes very, it's something I've wanted to write on if I sort of put my academic hat back on, how different nationalities respond, and I've done a lot of conflicts around the world, and I have to say this, by the way, to Indian nationalists, you really are up there amongst the most unpleasant, and it doesn't do you any favors, by the way. Because other people see this, and even if I don't mind the abuse, other people from outside world see it and think, they don't sound like a particularly pleasant bunch. Maybe take a tip, more, I don't know, sort of reconciliatory, right? I think it's very important for you and me, James. Like, I very much care about India, its history, its role in the world.
Of course.
If I didn't, I wouldn't talk about it. And, I have hosted some people on the show who I don't agree with them on many things, and they know that, but we have a very good personal relationship. I'm talking about.
But that's what it should be about. And in most cases, it is. Listen, you know what? You deal with the subjects we deal with. Abuse comes with the territory. It's absolutely the point I'm making is that they're right up there as being some of the most abusive, and it really doesn't do any favors. So it's just a little bit of a diversion on all of this to people who sort of believe that shouting abuse is it's not, because other people read those comments and they make up their minds on it, and it less is more. And sometimes you get a better response by saying, listen, I hear what you're saying, I don't agree, and let me explain why I don't agree. And that will get you a lot further by reasoned, rationed, decent, polite exchange, rather than just coming in and screaming abuse left, right, and center.
James is hard. It's hard to get a word in with James now. He's
really on this. Yeah. I'm going to make my point.
So no,
let's make mine as well. Okay, Michael, go ahead. I want to make a point as well,
Well, I was going to say we can make this far less controversial by just pivoting towards Kosovo. That's just a far less
Christ, no, not today.
topic.
No. Seriously. No.
Yeah, from my perspective, look, it's also challenging. I think for a couple of reasons. I'm a relatively young guy, so inexperience or immaturity, you get that. Equally, my channel's smaller than James is, for example. So people are like, well, you're just a kid on the internet. What do you know? And it's not. It sort of doesn't really add anything to the quality of the conversation. I appreciate the ability to have divergences of opinion, and I think that no one would be amiss to recognize that most of the territorial issues that exist today are because of the former colonial powers, or specifically the British,
right,
in the case of India and Pakistan, or in much of the Middle East, right? The rudimentary, arbitrary carving up of lands across whatever lines you felt like is the underlying, reason we have half these conflicts or instabilities.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I try to be very fair. I think James tries to be very fair in acknowledging these. It doesn't mean that we still don't have our own respective opinions about them or what we think might be the best solution forward. As I said, I think personally it would be nice for Pakistan to have a more stable government, and I say that really respectfully. I'll try to, but that still doesn't make some Pakistanis very happy. They're like, oh, so you're trying to determine what our country's governance model should be. No, not at all. I just want there to be peace and stability to ensure that all can prosper. And I think it's a shame, therefore, when the nuances of a conversation are simply broken down into black or white, which they never are in geopolitics or international relations. And and I'll reiterate the point that we made earlier on, and then we will definitely pivot to Kosovo and Serbia, James, don't worry.
No, know what? Let's not do it. Not today. Not today.
The point I want to make.
No, I think you're just joking, but if I might slip in, I am sometimes rather grateful that Serbia and India aren't next to each other.
Oh boy. But no, the last point I just want to make.
Had to sneak that one in.
Everyone has opinions about issues that they don't have any affiliation with, and it's no different, right? A lot of people who are frustrated by white people, Westerners, condescendingly describing the issues of the global South. Well, you guys do it as much about the British and how much of a shithole London is, or how much of a hellhole America is becoming. It goes both ways, guys. So let's try to just be respectful.
Anyway,
something we can all agree on is a shithead. Sorry. Go for it. Sorry, Michael.
I can talk about the shithole that my country might be, becoming, but that's
Christ, you've got to go back to a country which is nicking people for saying stuff like that. Be careful.
Yeah, I'm going home in 3 weeks, but still, I mean, the one thing that I will say about the Brits is that they will, they'll take the piss on their own country until someone questions their own cuisine.
Well, until a Yank appears and starts talking about it. Oh, sorry, Michael.
Yeah, no, seriously, exactly. I mean, it's sort of like, oh, and by the way, can I just also sneak into everyone saying, what about Scotland? What about Wales? What about Northern Ireland? Guys, yeah, absolutely. What about them? I fully support their right to have a vote. And I think that you will find that most people in Britain do. So before you pull out that one, we've heard it all before.
Yes.
It's really, really interesting doing this sometimes, isn't it? That these aren't new comments. So,
well, okay. So
anyway, Michael, so trepidation about heading back to the States.
Yeah,
what's going on? Has Trump given up? Has Trump given up on Ukraine?
Has Trump given up on Ukraine? Oh, here's the thing about Trump, which makes him unbelievably easy to understand and unbelievably annoying to put up with. Trump operates on ego. He operates absolutely on ego. He's not interested in long-term geopolitical strategy, security, or stability. I mean, he gets frustrated.
Hang on, Michael. He did. I have to give credit where credit's due. The Marco Rubio and administration did work quite well to get the ceasefire established in India, Pakistan. I think we have to be the Americans did do quite impressive on that. You don't agree?
Because India and Pakistan is second or third page news as far as America's concerned, right?
But that's besides the point.
But also, to be fair, I mean, it was done very quickly. If this had been low-level skirmishes for 6 months and they weren't listening to him, I think that's the question, and that comes out of it. And that, I think, is what we're seeing in Ukraine. You're right, Michael. It seems that Trump is driven by ego. But what's interesting is that it doesn't seem to be an ego that says, I won't give up on something. Now it becomes a matter of honor, that it's almost like ego. I want to get this solved. If I can't get it solved, I'm not going to waste any more time on it. It's their loss, not mine, which is a rather interesting psychological approach.
I mean, the whole thing with Ukraine is whether or not he wants to put his name to a ceasefire. And I mean, the last thing that's come out of the news, and I'm going to be posting on my YouTube channel later on today, the little press conference that Putin had given earlier today. It's about 1 a.m. Moscow time. It was that Putin had said, in the wake of Victory Day, that he is willing to once again meet with the Ukrainians on unconditional peace terms if they agree to it. I don't know if the Ukrainian side is going to agree to this, but Putin has once again said he is willing to meet with the Ukrainian side in Turkey to resume the Istanbul conferences that had taken place about 3 years ago that were scuttled by, according to him, Western interference or so. So make of it whatever it is that you will. Whether or not that is something that is an indirect reference to Trump, who wants to take credit for it or bank on that so he can take credit for it, is up for grabs. I don't know. The other thing that we should talk about, if we can, and I see by the clock that we're coming up on almost an hour here, is that Trump has seemingly distanced himself from Netanyahu and is looking to find separate peace agreements, ceasefire agreements with Yemen, and even separate peace agreements with Hamas, for the very simple reason that, according to the media, Trump's ego has once again been wounded because Netanyahu had at one point said that he can absolutely manipulate and control Donald Trump, which is something that Trump will absolutely respond to. So we got a couple of things going on here, right? We have a renewed possibility for a ceasefire in Ukraine. We have the possibility, although very, very, very superficially, this breaking of cordiality between Trump and Netanyahu, largely, if not exclusively, because Trump's narcissistic ego has been challenged.
What about the alternative, though, that Putin's offer of talks is his attempt to try to drive a wedge between the US and Europe, right? Because in principle, the Trump administration is now behind this 30-day ceasefire proposal that the European Coalition of the Willing, whatever they call it, suggested in Kiev when they visited over the past couple of days. But obviously that's not good for Putin, because at the moment the rapprochement between Moscow and DC continues, and that is Putin's lifeline to an extent. The economy of Russia isn't great. It's managing, but it's not as good as it could be, right? And he would, I think, any normal head of state would appreciate some sanctions release. But obviously, what does this intended ceasefire propose? That if you don't play ball, we are going to sanction the hell out of you. I think that was one of the quotes from a journalist that was covering the events in Kiev. And I think that Putin trying to offer the talks directly in is it Saudi Arabia and Riyadh is what he wants to demonstrate to Washington, or Trump at least, that he is a man of peace, but he wants to do it on Russian terms, right?
Right.
And There's no immediate ceasefire. Because he is in a sticky wicket, right? He's in a tricky situation because he can't reject it outright, but equally he can't accept it because then it looks like Russia's not leading the charge, and he wants to make sure that. So he's going to offer a proposal, but on Russia's terms, right? We're serious about peace, but we'll show it in our own way. So I don't know. It's quite an interesting sort of calculus. Putin is trying to control the narrative again, control the framing, because he wants to maximize that engagement with America, but also not lose face of it to his own people, right? I don't know if you disagree with that, but it's a tricky one he's trying to play.
Well, I mean, he has largely acknowledged the United States as a key partner for peace. He has acknowledged Donald Trump as a potential broker for peace. Europe is irrelevant as far as Putin is concerned, as far as Moscow is concerned. The coalition of the willing is, according to Russia, and to an extent, even as far as the United States is concerned. I don't know, a ragtag group of elites cosplaying as agents of, I don't know, diplomatic leverage, which is, for the most part, just being ignored. I mean, I don't know. I don't know whether this is, strategic or whether this is something that will be a blunder, down the road.
James, I mean, you haven't chimed in for a moment. What do you think?
Well, to be honest, I was also sort of thinking, I want to return to Michael's point about Palestinian recognition, but maybe we'll just park that for a few minutes.
Yeah, maybe we should cover that.
Because I think that was such an interesting story. And it doesn't make sense to me, to be honest. But anyway, we'll come back to that in a sec. Look, I mean, I think there is all sorts of guessing games going on at the moment as to what, does Putin feel that, he's made a strategic error in his handling of Trump. And now sort of, with the Europeans, it was very interesting, obviously, seeing Starmer, Macron, Merz and Tusk lining up with Zelensky, showing that Europe is very clearly behind, that talking about tougher sanctions on Russia, hitting the financial sector, the banking sector even more strongly. I mean, one would have imagined that it had been pretty much closed by now, but not. So, maybe there is that sense, sort of Putin realizes that, he's got to be showing some sort of willing and saying, look, I'm willing to go into talks. I want direct talks, unconditional talks. It's quite interesting, and sort of might just relate it back to the India-Pakistan, is that, when you talk about dynamics of peace processes, and I see this also, it's also been quite interesting. So, for example, Greece and Turkey, over the years, Greece has been much more willing to have multilateral talks and outside involvement, legal recourses, whereas Turkey's taken the position it wants direct bilateral negotiations. It's the same with India and Pakistan. It's often the case that the party that sees itself as the stronger one prefers to have bilateral talks because they think, right, when I'm in the comfort of a room with the other side, they can be bullied. So it's very, very interesting to see that, when we talk about that, how is that, what's behind it? And there doesn't seem to be, Michael, I mean, I saw the reports of it, but, correct me if I'm wrong, maybe the Russian media is reporting a little bit more sort of meat on those bones as to sort of what exactly is going on there, and what Russia sees of this, or is this just an open statement at this point that, as I say, these European leaders had made these very strong statements, and so Putin sort of, this is his counteroffer.
Well, it's a counter proposal, isn't it?
Yeah.
He's a gambler. It's gambling because, I mean, the point I was trying to make maybe a bit poorly was his back is up against the wall. We have got a pretty united Europe. It was despite his slightly awkward moment to Friedrich Merz's, failure to be voted in initially as chancellor. He was eventually, and he's gone immediately, right, to Ukraine, a real show of commitment or whatever, a show of intent. And he's a lot more bullish on his position of Ukraine than Schultz was, to my support, actually, personally. But, so suddenly you've got the powerhouse that is economics of Germany, And, Keir and Macron have been very united over nuclear rhetoric. And suddenly they and Donald Tusk, obviously the fastest militarizing country in Europe, Poland, and then they forward all these details and the suggestions, and Trump's like, "Yes, guys, that's not great if you're the Kremlin, is it? Right? Suddenly, you're hoping to keep these two broken. You're happy to see the transatlantic relationship in the toilet, the NATO alliance fragmented, and suddenly, like, oh shit." Because it illustrates to me that Europe is happy to pick up the slack, and that's more what Trump wants. He's happy to commit.
And suddenly, the very conciliatory tone taken by JD Vance, of course, after his Munich Security Conference speech early in the year, they did one in the United States on home territory, and he was sort of saying about the partnership between Europe and the US, which.
No, for sure. That's all I'm trying to say is like, I think tacitly Trump is quite happy to continue supporting Ukraine. He just wants more of the grunt work to be picked up by the Europeans. That's all it is, right? And that's what Putin is pretty terrified of. I'm not suddenly saying that Europe can pick up the slack and is completely free of its own issues, but I certainly think that Trump is more willing to just foot the bill a little bit more if it means America's not as directly involved.
But again, doesn't this come back to this really interesting point about the psychology of Trump? That
what aspect?
In that situation, you would imagine that he would have felt slighted. He wanted to be the person. He made the promise that he could solve it in 24 hours. And I mean, there was a piece, was it in Wall Street Journal or Washington Post, where he apparently expressed surprise that he wasn't able to solve Gaza and Ukraine within 24 hours, and that it had surprised him and shocked him that he hadn't been able to. But I think what I find really interesting about this is that sort of mentality that you would imagine that the ego would have been so bruised by the fact that he couldn't, that he would have turned. What has gone on, because there was all that talk about how close he was to Putin and that he wanted to suddenly open up and do all these deals. And yet now it does sound that Washington is actually taking a much more positive line towards Europe, saying, as you pointed out, that Europe can lead on this. And I'm just trying to work out what, as much as anyone can work out what's going on in Trump's mind, because this doesn't seem to be in line with what you'd imagine from his character. That he hadn't succeeded, and yet now he's willing to sort of throw his weight behind the Europeans and say, look, get on with it, and I'm not going to cut military aid. Or was it simply that he got that deal with Ukraine, the minerals deal, and that bought him, and that's all that it took? He can now say, I did the deal. The Ukrainians are the ones who came up. I'm not going to get anything out of Putin and Russia and their minerals and everything like that. I'll take this deal, and that's the win.
I mean, I think that is ultimately how the way that Trump looks at it. He's looking at a way in which he can capitalize on any kind of deal. And whether it is in Europe's favor or Russia's favor, it doesn't matter. As far as he's concerned, he wants that Nobel Peace Prize moment, right? If he can cut a deal with Putin and sideline Europe and, checkmate Ukraine, he will. If he can somehow bandwagon with Europe, which I don't think that he will, he'll do that as well. The reality is that as far as, the territory is concerned, Russia has not lost any territory that it has occupied in Ukraine. It has repelled a second offensive into the Kursk Oblast over the past couple of days, right? The so-called Easter truce, the ceasefire that Russia unilaterally agreed to, was, according to Russia, violated by Ukraine. There was another incursion within the Kursk and Belgorod Oblast, which was completely repelled, and yet the Ukrainian side is reporting that this was another attempt at trying to infiltrate Russian territory. And however, brief that they had occupied territory, they had done. This shows that Russia is still vulnerable. They are weak. And the fact that Russia is now looking for some kind of ceasefire again shows that Putin is willing at best, desperate at worst, to find some ceasefire agreement. The point is that Russia still has the leverage it still has the leverage at the peace negotiating table. Despite what Europe wants to say about creating an equitable, more equilibrium balance between the Russian and Ukrainian side, the Ukrainians have not been able to recapture any town or major city that Russia has occupied since the incursion of the special military operation. And so in this case, the European side, seeking to fund the Ukrainian side, start a tribunal against Putin, against other elements of the Russian, political authority is, I'm sorry, little more than symbolic cosplay.
But it is if the Europeans and the Americans are threatening all-out sanctions, it's more than that. Trump doesn't.
What sanctions are you going to do at this point that is going to economically cripple Russia?
The
country has been under sanctions since 2014. At this point, they've been able to pivot towards the rest of the world. If they can get Central Asia, if they can get BRICS, if they can get China to all of a sudden economically isolate Russia, that's a game changer. If you're going to initiate sanctions against the Russian state that you haven't done beforehand, lots of luck to you.
Yeah, obviously there are lots of loopholes and just holes generally in the sanctions. There's a lot of issues, but why would Putin be so quick to offer a counter proposal of direct talks, which he has been avoiding ever since the full-scale war began, unless he felt that he had to do something to get out of a tight spot?
One of two options. All right, two options. One is exactly that. He's in a tight spot, and he needs one. Okay, that's one. I'll give you that. The other one is that it's a rhetorical gesture, simply to wait for Ukraine and the West to reject. Once again, so he can turn to the audience and say, we offered once again an opportunity for a ceasefire and they rejected. One of the two.
Right. I don't know. I mean, James, what do you think? Oh, that's a big breathe in.
Yeah, no, I'm just trying to think of exactly what could be going on here, because we do hear these conflicting stories. There'll be those who are saying, and there'll be lots of people watching who will be saying that, it's all just Western media, that Russia is on the verge of collapse, it's doing fine and everything like that. But you also have a lot of very serious voices that I happen to respect and I think have got good critical judgment, who are saying that the Russian economy is in a really, really bad way, that it can't hold up a lot longer. And that maybe Putin is feeling the pressure on this. The numbers, you're right. I mean, it doesn't seem that the front lines are moving drastically, but it does seem that the casualty rate is still incredibly high, all things considered. You've raised the point that we are now firmly into spring. And so that there is a sense that over summer, there could be a lot more fighting going on, with all the implications that carries either way. But it was very interesting. Europeans put on the table a 30-day ceasefire, and exactly what that means is that. So you can read that in all sorts of ways. That look, let's stop the fighting and just make it a 30-day ceasefire, and hope that then you can make it another 30 days and keep the ball rolling. So you don't say let's just have a permanent ceasefire at this stage because neither side will want it. There will be those who will be saying, look, this is something that Ukrainians are obviously putting a lot of pressure on, that they haven't got the manpower in the same way that the Russians have. Their troops are exhausted sitting on the front lines. They need to be rotated out and spend. So that could be why Ukraine is pushing for it. And that's why Russia won't want to go for it, because it sees this as a sign of Ukrainian weakness, that it knows that those troops are tired and things. So there could be all sorts, and I think this is one of the things that you get to when dealing with conflict, is that, you spend, all of us, who also in analysis are constantly trying to second guess exactly what every different move means, and it will be read by the different sides in very, very different ways. And it's trying to sort of pick through all of that and what the gameplay is. And it's not about just, right, okay, if side A proposes this, what's side B's response? It's always a question of side A proposes this. We can work out what side B's response is, but what's our counter response? So it's always 2 steps ahead that you're thinking when you're doing political analysis, by the way. It's not, don't think about, what happens. You think about what your response to whatever is you're offering at this stage. And that will be going on a lot at the moment. There'll be a lot of thinking ahead of trying to work out, what all this means. But it was interesting, certainly, that this proposal was put down on the table for for talks, and the suggestion that they could be held in Turkey at the same time Europe sort of saying the 30-day ceasefire. Do those come together in some sort of way? And what is the bigger picture in all of this? Because of course Russia's opening gambit in all of this is going to be, well, we want the territory that we've got, and it seems inconceivable that Ukraine is going to accept that. So is this just simply the case, as pointed out, that Putin is putting it on the table, knowing that the second they walk into talks?
Well, I think on that point, Macron has made it clear that no talks have to be preceded by a ceasefire. So the Europeans are attempting to stand firm by saying, that's nice, it's a good start, Putin, but we are on the proviso that you commit to this ceasefire whilst we also undertake the diplomatic negotiations. But that's obviously, I think, going to be the sticking point, and therefore why things won't change. As much as one hopes this could be a different time around, this ceasefire proposal is different, I don't see. I think they're going to continue just as they are. And to Michael's point, I mean, I don't disagree with you, mate, about the resilience of the Russian economy and how many sanctions are left. More my point was, though, that there was an interesting fact that Putin quite quickly made this counter proposal. He also, when he made the address last night, it was very late. He also didn't take questions, which he usually likes to do. I think all three of us are quite familiar with Putin's personal demeanor as an autocrat, and he didn't do that. It was quite out of character for him, I think. So I don't disagree with you on that. I just wonder why he felt the need to come out with this quite quick counter proposal is all I'm saying. But maybe for the last 10 minutes, shall we talk about the Middle East? James, you did mention obviously Palestinian potential.
Yeah. No, I think Michael raised a really, really interesting point about this news report that had come out, and it was being reported in the Israeli press, which was quite interesting, that there had been supposedly this falling out with Netanyahu and the Americans. Trump had said he was preparing to make a big announcement, and that could be recognition of a Palestinian state. I find this really, really difficult to get my head around where this idea is coming from, because so you can make the argument that Trump just acts in a very unpredictable way, but so you could say, what's the upside in all of this? What does he get from the Middle East states? So it's generally accepted that the big diplomatic win of the first Trump presidency was the Abraham Accords. This agreement where he got the United Arab Emirates, he got Bahrain, he got Morocco and Sudan to all recognize Israel. So suddenly you had 4 more Arab states which had recognized. And, for all the other failings of the first term of the Trump presidency, this is generally accepted, although a lot of people obviously are very unhappy about it, as probably his biggest diplomatic victory. One that, as I always point out, in the case of Morocco, it came at the promise of Western Saharan self-determination. He basically sold out Western Sahara and handed it over to Morocco in return for getting Morocco to recognize Israel. A point, by the way, that many, many senior Republicans, old school Republicans, were extremely unhappy about, not least of all because James Baker, who had been very senior in earlier, I think it was Bush 1 administration, if I remember rightly, had been the envoy for Western Sahara. And this went against sort of positions. But anyway, that by the by. So the question is, the feeling had always been that before October 2023 and the Hamas attack and everything that's happened in Gaza, that there was a sense that maybe Saudi Arabia, which would be the huge prize, would be willing to recognize Israel. And that would have been a massive, that would have been game changer territory. for all sorts of very obvious reasons. And there was a sense that Trump was going to pursue that. That is absolutely impossible at the moment. There is no way in any world that you could see any Arab state now recognizing Israel under Netanyahu after everything that has happened. But then you hear these reports that maybe Trump could recognize Palestine, and it just seems so out of step with everything that he's done up till now, even if it's a question that he's fallen out with Netanyahu. I mean, this would be the mother of punishments for Netanyahu. And it just doesn't seem to make sense. It seems to run against everything that many of those closest to Trump would have, would believe
James,
in. So,
if I can just add another element to this as we sort of, openly think about it, is the notion that it's to do with this, it's related to the desire by the American or Trump administration, at least, to bring in private contractors to administer humanitarian aid in Gaza, right? Which some people fear is basically the beginning of the gradual absorption of Gaza by Israel, right? Because the UN is refusing to, colleagues I know have said the doctrine is they're not going to be working with the private sector groups at all because it violates international law. And therefore, this is sort of, they are beginning to basically evict the Palestinians from Gaza, and eventually it's just going to become part of Israel. But the thing that conflicts with that is the fact that Trump has basically cut off communication with the Netanyahu administration, which sort of would contradict that. So I don't really know what to make of it.
I mean, if I
just very quickly, it just doesn't make sense though, because if you recognize Palestine, then you recognize it in the 1967 borders, and Gaza would be part of an independent Palestine. So you're recognizing something then that you have no intention of honoring. Now, people would say, well, that would be Trump through and through. Well, but this just doesn't seem to add up. I can't see a logic that's going on here.
No, that's what I mean. Sorry,
Michael. Yeah. I mean, no, I absolutely agree with James. And if he does, I mean, he is going to suddenly be the most unconventional champion of the left that we have ever had. But he's not going to do. He's not going to do that. I mean, look, the accelerationist in me is, every so often hoping that Trump just burns everything to the ground, fast enough for us to get what we want. But that's not going to happen. I don't see, unless I am wrong, I don't see any evidence that he is going to recognize the state of Palestine. The man just a couple of months ago was planning on turning Gaza into Mar-a-Lago 2.0.
Yeah.
So precisely. I just don't see this. I mean, unless he is so erratic and so unpredictable based on his ego, then it plays into every world leader that the only way to get what you want is to effectively kiss Trump's ass. Make him feel like he's important and get what you want. Because that's how it works. And if this is suddenly the hidden strategy of the Palestinian, Fatah or Hamas or whatever it happens to be, or just simply because, Netanyahu openly proclaimed that he can play Trump like a fiddle, I don't see that working. Because what this ultimately will do is create a major rift between him and the system, the political system in the United States, which I'm very sorry to say is absolutely fundamentally committed to the existence of the Israeli state with all the territory that it occupies, West Bank, Golan Heights, and everything else. So
that's what doesn't make sense in all of this. You're absolutely right, Michael. It just doesn't add up, this story. I don't understand whether, because then it would be right. Suddenly, having been such a champion, you're absolutely right. There are too many people around, and it's not the existence of the state of Israel. I think, we can say that that enjoys cross-party support in the United States, and that much is clear. It's the point that you made. It's the fact that it's Gaza and West Bank which have been increasingly proclaimed as part, that this should be part of sovereign Israel, that hang all the resolutions, the international opinion on that, and I'm just doing a quick plug. I did a really, really interesting interview a few weeks ago with an absolutely excellent Israeli pollster, Dalia Scheindlin, in which, we spoke, you can find it on my channel, about Israeli public opinion. And, she was making a very interesting point about the fact that, 20, 30 years ago, they would refer to the West Bank. Now it's Judea and Samaria. That is the way that it's referred to in all the Israeli media. It has been, in the International Court of Justice has said very clearly, it handed down a very important legal ruling saying that Israel has de facto annexed large parts of the West Bank. It's engaged in the process of annexation. That all gets turned on its head if you now have a US leader who says, no, we don't recognize any of this. And remember, of course, that Trump 1 recognized Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights, which is something that is not recognized by the rest of the world. So on the one hand, he's given Israel a piece of territory that the rest of the world has said is not Israel's to have. And then now suddenly there's this report that about face on
let's be honest. He also moved the American embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. So he's an ardent Zionist, right? So the way that I see this is that it's a power play to just simply, threaten to cut off U.S. aid to Israel. Israel responds by saying, you're right, mea culpa, we'll do whatever you say. Reagan, threatened to cut off all aid to Rabin back in the 80s. And count to 10, and when you reach between 6 and 7, the Israeli government says, you're right, I'm sorry, we'll do whatever you say. So I wouldn't necessarily read too much into this. This is just simply a way of, Trump kind of playing reverse psychology.
But it was just such a weird report, Michael.
There was an interesting article, bit of analysis I saw that sort of showed that because of how far Israel or the Netanyahu security cabinet have gone in Gaza now, it's actually alienated the Saudis to such an extent that they've actually been trying to sort of work with the Iranians to try to sort of curb the situation. There was some reverse analysis there, which I thought was quite interesting.
It's very hard to gaslight your own people when genocide is happening.
Sorry, Michael, what?
It's very hard to gaslight your own citizens in the Arab world when literal state-sponsored genocide is happening.
Yeah,
but again, we come back to the fact it was a really, really odd story. I think, I think there's another point that's really interesting in all of this is this Steve Witkoff character who has been leading on Middle East and on Ukraine. And with with Walt's been effectively sacked as national security advisor and been moved over to UN. I mean, I saw reports that, Trump was considering appointing but everything we're seeing at the moment would actually seem to suggest that maybe, this is an old friend of Trump. But everyone says Trump doesn't do a lot of loyalty. Is there something going on behind the scenes here within the Trump administration that maybe now, after the euphoria of 3 months in power, breaking everything, they're starting to sort of like wake up a few people and realize that something else is going on here?
Could he recognize Palestine on the proviso of something else, right? He'll recognize Palestine if the Palestinian Authority or whoever it is agree that, it's in West Bank and that Gaza is, on a context like that, because I feel the
trouble is that would be worse for the Israelis. The Israelis would they'd be much, much more comfortable about saying, give the Palestinians Gaza, we want West Bank. That it's the West Bank which has the real symbolic, religious, historical, cultural significance for Israelis, not Gaza. So I think if he made an offer to the Palestinians, you can have Gaza but not West Bank. I think there wouldn't be a Palestinian leader who'd be able to possibly even begin to
Well,
say
that's the other point. We need a clearer leadership on the Palestinian side. I believe Mohammed Abbas had appointed someone in the past week, but he is trying to line up a successor. I haven't really read much about who they are.
Abbas is widely considered to be a joke by most Palestinians.
Well, I'm not saying he is
little to no legitimacy.
I mean, I think
senior
again we come back to the point.
We need a clear delineation of authority, right? The PA are washed up. They've been largely undermined for years. The Netanyahu government, I think, is a real sticking problem in all of this, because as long as they are overseeing the Israeli perspective, you're never going to see any reasonableness in terms of, I don't know, statehood for Palestine, even if Trump does recognize it. So, you know, and that's part of the problem, right? If we had any other government than the one that involves Ben frigging Gvir, then this might be more of a reasonable, there might be more of a reasonable path forward. But they're so ultra nationalist, you're not going to see that. And again, that's part of the problem why even if Trump does make some revelation tomorrow, whenever it is, doesn't change anything for the people directly on the ground, does it? Because Israeli controls the strings. Yes, okay, they get a lot of money from the US and that might change, but I don't think Trump's going to go that far. He might make some, I don't know.
I think we'll be terribly let down by this big announcement he's going to make, lifting tariffs on countries or something like that is a good way. You know, I don't know. It's very difficult. And, you know, one wonders then if you know, there's also a bit of strategic rethinking going on in various different ways, but I just can't see a strategic rethink that would allow. But it just seems strange that the press in Israel would be reporting something like this.
Yeah,
it just seems so off the mark for what could happen that you think, why would they possibly say anything that seems so odd? Is there something to it? You know, is Trump that unpredictable? But then you start thinking, right, okay, what could he possibly be offered in return?
Well, keep in mind, James, that also the way that Trump works is the way that he retained that leadership in the polls in the run-up to the US election is he feeds off contradiction, of controversiality. And as soon as he wasn't in the news cycle, that benefited the Democrats and Harris for a while. So Trump has to constantly make these rather absurd or outlandish statements or just potential actions, right? He's done a couple in the past where he said something was going to happen and then he sort of
yeah, exactly.
So it's all smoke and mirrors potentially. You know, he might use the Palestinian thing to bring greater attention to him, and then he'd be like, but first we're going to talk about the progress we're making in the Iranian nuclear negotiations, which is also something that I think we should keep a watch on for the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, no, absolutely agree. Yeah. Absolutely agree. I think this is something that's been boiling away in the background, and you know, that was my plan for this week.
Yeah, I'm saying likewise.
Oh Christ, no, not again. I deferred on South Sudan. But
yes, I saw you beat me to the punch, but I'm waiting for my better.
Well, I gave you 2 weeks, but don't, you know, and if I might be really honest, that is an issue that has been completely neglected, and you realize there's all sorts of issues.
As Sudan's civil war comes to a pause, South Sudan's may well be beginning. Which is,
and it's a horrific situation, and it's a you know, South Sudan is a real tragedy,
which we have
in
not
all sorts
about.
of ways. I mean, this really is a country that, you know, there was so high. Well, I mean, there were high hopes, probably unrealistic right from day one, but you know, it's sunk into war, and it just comes down to a rivalry between two leaders, and that has taken on ethnic dimensions and everything. It's a really worrying situation. And last war there killed, you know, 400,000 people died. So this isn't something to be ignored either. But there is so much bandwidth that the world can consume, I think.
I think what's also interesting to keep in mind is that all of this plays into what we've talked about with Kashmir, to bring it full circle, which is self-determination and autonomy of disputed territories, or ones that want independence, like Darfur. and the genocide of Darfur under their tyrant in the past 15 years. So yeah, no, Africa, South Sudan, very passionate. And speaking of that, I will probably not be able to do this live stream in a couple of weeks because I will be in Namibia. So we may well try to do it, but I will be speaking to you from a tent, possibly in the Namibian desert somewhere on the west coast, or maybe even in Oh, Michael, you'll love this as well. I'll be in Angola, so maybe I can bring back a communist trinket.
What are you doing going to Namibia and Angola for?
Yeah, what are you doing in Africa? I mean, more power to you, but still.
But yeah, exactly.
Well, I mean, fun fact for everyone, other than my specialty being Russia and Europe, Africa is my main area, and I lived there for more than 2.5 years in a few different bouts. But yeah, I have a lot of experience with Africa, and I wanted to go.
Excellent.
I'm going to be doing some more travel vlogging, actually. So I started another YouTube channel.
All right, good.
Subscribe to my travel vlogs, but not just vlogging about, hey guys, I'm on a deck chair, because I think it's interesting when I went to Argentina in January, I went to the museum that was funded by the Ministry of Defense, and you learn a lot about the Falklands War. So I thought it was really interesting to go to the places on the ground and see them. As much as you can be like, well, I talk about India, Pakistan, I talk about Kashmir or Sudan, but like I actually go to those places to see them firsthand. So yeah, I'm gonna be speaking to you from Namibia. Maybe we can sort something out, but I don't know if there's anything going on in Namibia at the moment. We could do a deep historical dive about the Cuban role in the Angolan War in the 1970s, was it?
I did a video a few months ago on the Angola wars, War of Independence, and then the Civil War. Yeah, I did. I've got a history of warfare, which I've only done 2 videos so far, but Angola was one of them because it was brutal, those wars in Angola. And it was also a fascinating conflict. You're right, because it pitted Soviet Union and Cuba against South Africa and apartheid South Africa and the United States. It was one of the sort of really, really interesting, and as I say, very, very brutal and bloody, that you'd have these Cuban and South African soldiers fighting alongside Angolan.
I find it fascinating. It's a really good podcast series that I will give a shout out to because it's probably my favorite historical one at the moment. But Real Dictators by Noisy Network. You can find it on any podcast app. Really good though, and the current one they're going through is Mr. Cuban dictator himself. Suddenly my mind's gone blank, right? All about his life and how he managed to take a medium-sized island nation into a global power, fighting along the lines of the United States. So it's insane what he managed to do. And
I had the good fortune to visit Cuba a few years ago, and it was a fascinating experience. It really, really was. Really in all sorts of ways. Probably one for another session. But
I'll be sure to try and get do you still have the bust, Michael, for our audience to see
seriously. I was about to say, if anyone was wondering if Michael was spurred on today, it was because he picked that up.
Purchased today in Yangiyoba, Tashkent. Look at this. This is beautiful. I should share with you, there was a full-size marble bust of Stalin on sale right behind some dishes that some babushka was selling. So you can get everyone and everything.
So anyone watching, I did tell him he does know that these are ironic, but I suspect that it hasn't. I think those will have a pride of place. Oh my gosh!
Yeah.
Listen, in 3 weeks, in 3 weeks, I will be on the plane back to the United States. My
good
time
luck getting back in with
sojourn,
those.
My time here in Central Asia is coming to a very memorable, definitive, and very sad end. So the next couple of weeks, I'm still grading final exams. I'll be meeting with my students, some final times. But by beginning of June, I'll be back in the United States and willing to give you all hot takes on what is going on in Trump's America.
So, look, maybe we could. It'd be great to do one in a couple of weeks, if at all possible. We'll see. But otherwise,
No,
we can do one more. We can absolutely do at least one more before I leave. Like I said,
it's only if Pyoty's not tenting in Namibia.
I mean, if you
No,
can get
I'll
internet,
definitely try to
you
figure that
know,
out. I'm also going to be capturing a fair amount of content for the travel channel, but I will be sure to pick up a Fidel
Give a
Castro.
shout out. What's your travel channel?
Pyoty's Footprints.
Okay.
So no,
Very
it's
nice.
just started. I've got like 100 subs. So if you want to go and subscribe there, guys, I have no idea really what I'm doing. I need to figure out what.
When you're really selling it, man.
Who of us,
not an
which
editor,
one of
so-
us really know what we're doing, you know? So
Well, James, he has the silver button in the background, which he always makes me feel incredible. He's always showing off to all of us. No, thank you guys. It's really good fun. We will be bringing out some memorabilia as well. Two liberals and a Marxist.
Merch,
T-shirts and baseball caps to a store near you at some point. I think that would be great.
we've got to get somebody to do a logo for us.
We need to
with
come up with a design. I think it would be fucking hilarious. Anyway, but everyone, I know it's been controversial. We appreciate you sticking with us. You know, we're not going to please everybody, but we do try to be. My expression I'm sort of using these days is balanced and while acknowledging my biases. You know, I know I'm biased, but I try to be aware of them while still talking about things. I think that's the best you can do. But
leftists, please stop Hindu phobia.
Yes. What else? Well, I wanted to say this was one of my favorite ones. We've talked about Ukraine and Russia. We've talked about the Middle East a little bit, and still Timothy recognized the fact that India and Pakistan are arguing. Most of the chat has been about Pakistan and Kashmir and India. So,
well,
we will go through all of them. I will go through all of them. I will go through all.
No,
of
Michael,
those
seriously, you don't want to. I told you, really, it's a very.
I went shopping.
Talking about Ukraine and Russia is bad.
Yeah. I went shopping for vodka today. I'll pour one out. I'll read them. You know, here we go. You know, it's all good.
Yeah, no, sometimes better not. But anyway, yeah, no, good speaking to you. A quick heads up, by the way, fingers crossed. My interview this week's with Richard Gowan.
What, my former boss? Oh, great.
Your former boss.
Have you spoken to him about my
No. I believe it or not, Pyoty, it's not an interview about you. It's I'm asking,
have you mentioned that you know me as well? Right? He's
I will bring it up tomorrow when I have a chat with him. No, I mean, and Pyoty will attest. I mean, Richard is one of probably the most informed voice on
the go-to guy on the UN
on United Nations, and so yeah, having a chat with him on State of the United Nations. The United Nations marks its 80th anniversary. Proposals for reform, morale within the organization. So so that's just a bit of a heads up for anyone who's interested in that. Hopefully, if it all goes well, then that'll be up on Tuesday. Cool. So yeah. But anyone, Pyoty, Michael, what have you got planned for this week?
Plug for my page. As soon as we're done here, I'm going to finish the press conference that Putin had given at 1 a.m. Regarding his proposal for a unconditional ceasefire talks with Ukraine, which, if you take Telegram at face value, about 5 minutes ago, I just got a notification saying that Zelensky is willing to meet with Putin in Istanbul. So take it as that. He is willing to meet with Putin.
Direct talks, leader talks, or...
Zelensky is willing to meet with Putin in Istanbul. Take it at face value. The other shameless plug for my page was I had a chat with Glenn Deason a couple of days ago regarding an article that I had written a couple of months ago regarding media and narrative within the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. It was my first time meeting Professor Deason. Very nice guy. I have to admit, I'm kind of a fan of his work, but he reached out to me. I was more than happy to meet with him. My interview with him was reposted on my page. It was originally on his. So, I'm moving up in the world. So next stage after Deason is John Mearsheimer.
My sort of what would I say? PTAs, PSs, public service, PSAs is Manu has just unsubscribed from my channel because of a lack of depth in knowledge, apparently. So I would kindly ask everybody to subscribe to replace him. I am going to Africa also because it is my birthday trip. I'll be turning another year around the sun, or whatever we say in English.
Happy birthday.
And I have a couple of video topics. I'll be releasing one shortly on the counter proposal by Putin as well, because I think that's worth a quick sort of rapid fire video. But yeah, I have some thematic videos coming out, some ideas about, understanding when we talk about truces or ceasefires, what do we actually mean? They're very sort of, utilized interchangeably, but they have very different connotations in reality. Some upscaling of the channel. So exciting things to come, and I always enjoy these true liberal Marxist conversations, and I look forward to doing so again in a couple of weeks with you, gentlemen. It was a pleasure, and I wish you all the very best for the next couple of
Piotr, thank you again, James. Always a pleasure.
And all of
Night,
you watched.
Night, everyone. Good.
Bye-bye.
Thanks for tuning in.
Yeah. Bye.